Ask Dan Schneider. This is Dan Schneider, and on this Ask Dan Schneider, I am answering a question that I've gotten a number of times over the last year or so. The latest iteration of that question comes from a reader named Aisha, or Aisha, Aishal. Aisha L. asked me about my Maggie Estep essay from last year, and whether or not I somehow might have violated some privacy, or might have been, talking too much about a woman who is dead. Uh, the question basically raises, did I have a right to talk about Maggie Estep? And of course, I had a right to talk about her. I knew her many years ago in the 1980s through the early 1990s. And, I hadn't known her for about 24 years. And I think one of the reasons that people have emailed me about Estep and the obituary I did about her was because I wasn't totally glowingly positive. There's this kind of crazy need in society to always say the best of people. Now, I thought highly of Maggie personally. I thought she was a good person. I did not know her for about the last quarter century of her life. I last saw her in 1990 or 91. She died in 2014. So there was quite a bit of time. The reason I wrote the essay in the obituary was because I did not like a lot of the stuff I was reading about Maggie online. Two things in particular. One, about how she died and how people made it seem that it came out of the blue, when clearly, if you looked at photos of her, she had the classic look of a drug user. And indeed, when she was younger, when I knew her in the 80s and early 90s, she was doing all sorts of drugs, mostly heroin, but a lot of other stuff too that at least I knew of. And the other thing was the fact that Maggie was bisexual or had lesbian tendencies as well. This was not spoken of. Now, it didn't have to be spoken of. It's perfectly fine that would not have been mentioned, and we could talk about her writing or whatnot. That brings up another point, though, is that Maggie Estep was not a good writer. She was not a good poet. She never really pushed herself to get better. Instead, she got a little bit of fame, fleeting, for 2 or 3 years in the early 1990s on MTV, doing a lot of these crap videos. And instead, she didn't push herself to become an actual writer of any substance. She just, posed. She did the Vogue kind of shit, and as a result, her poetry, which really wasn't poetry, sucked. The thing about Maggie was she led a very false life in a way. She was a suburban girl from New Jersey, I believe. She liked horses. She liked riding. She had a lot of these kinds of what you call white bread interests, but she tried to portray herself as something other than a suburban Jewish girl, and instead tried to portray herself as somehow hip or hip-hop or inner city, and she was none of those things. And she knew this, and she knew she was false. Someone once asked me why David Foster Wallace killed himself, and I said, I think the reason Wallace killed himself was because he knew he was a fraud. And to a certain extent, even though she didn't commit suicide, I think Maggie Estep knew that she herself was a fraud as well. And I think this was part of her personal unhappiness. I think it's why, at least as far as I know, she never got married. Another thing that annoyed me and that I wrote about was a lot of the people who wrote obituaries of her didn't know Maggie at all. They didn't know half the things that I've just mentioned about her personally. They were either people who saw her on MTV growing up and liked her crap, spoken word stuff, or they were, sort of faux celebrities. There was the comic book guy. I forget whether it was Neil Gaiman. It might have been Neil Gaiman or one of those types who supposedly was a friend of hers. He wrote some pithy, like 2-sentence obituary of her. And it just seems to me that it was emblematic of Maggie's life, that it was that her death and her obituary was filled with people who just used her. Maggie was one of these people that constantly let herself be used. She let herself be used sexually. She let herself be used personally. She let herself be used artistically, till the point that there was nothing left in her, at least when I knew her. She was on drugs. She was in a very bad way. And it always saddened me, not that she was ever going to do anything great, but there was something just very sad about Maggie Estep and the life she lived. The fact that she died relatively young at 50, or I guess 51, was equally sad. And, I had known her when she was young, when she was cute, pretty, and she had at least some potential to have a good life. Might not have been with me, but there was potential, and it was squandered. And that's one of the things that I almost always find kind of unforgivable. Maggie squandered her life. She squandered what little talent she had. She could have been, for example, a good newspaper reporter. She wrote silly, bad detective stories. She wrote those shitty spoken word poems. She never pushed herself. She never, ever pushed herself. And that's probably the biggest thing about her. And it gets back to the question, was I being disrespectful of a dead woman? No. I told it like it is. That's what you have to do, so that there aren't future Maggie Esteps, that people in the future who are these young women who might have admired her in some way, although not for the right reasons, don't become like Maggie Estep. Don't throw their lives away. Don't waste their time and talent, if they have any. Don't do these things that just mean nothing, because Maggie Estep, no one knows who she is now. No one's going to read her writing. No one's going to care. They don't care now. They won't care in 50 years. And she threw that away. And to simply tell that, to try to help other people, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And I think Maggie, if there is something in the afterlife, would appreciate that. She would appreciate that something good came of her own personal failure. Anyway, that's the way I see it. And that's why I wrote the obituary. That's why I'm doing and answering these questions about the Ask Dan Schneider series about her. I knew Maggie Estep. I cared about Maggie Estep. People who knew her, some of these celebrities, the New Yorkers that she was associated with, none of them gave a shit about her, really. They really didn't. They wouldn't have treated her the way they did. I'm not going to go into details, especially about the New Yorkers and some of the males that were a part of that coterie. But that's, anyway, the answer to the question. I did not disrespect Maggie Estep. I did respect what I knew about her and our relationship, and that's the best that anyone can do. There were some people that were upset with it. There was one woman that I had referenced in an early version of the essay that was upset with my mention of her, but she again led a very Estep kind of life too, so I've sort of let that go. Nonetheless, that's why I wrote the essay about Maggie Estep, the obituary about her death. She was a part of my life briefly and many years ago, and I was saddened to see her die. And that's the way I chose to, I guess some people would say, honor her life, was to tell the truth about her so that other people might do better in the future.